Of course, Marie Antoinette never actually said let them eat cake, or brioche for that matter. But it's now or never. I'm finally going to have my cake and eat it. This endeavor was going to be anything but a piece of cake. It was going to be the whole damn thing, and I wasn't going to bake it, but make it using the very craft that faced the guillotine during the French Revolution: knitting. But more on that later. Bows, lace, ruffles, and frills are on the menu, so buckle up because these hot puns were stale long before they left the oven. I'll be listing patterns down below once they're released, but you can also head over to my Patreon and become a free member for the latest updates. Thank you so much for joining these past few weeks. A Marie Antoinette-inspired video had been on the cards for quite some time, but the absolutely thrilling discovery made during my Vivienne Westwood dress project simply pushed me past the pointelle of no return. This time round, I'll be creating an entire outfit using exclusively fine weight yarns, because the theme is excess to the point of result. Either way, why be coquette when you can be cakeette? Starting with a basic human sponge filled with useless information.
C'est moi.
The decorating will begin at the bottom tier of the cake with an overpiped chantilly cream frosting. The top will then be draped in a pastel pink lace fondant with a diamond and bow pattern. Is it too late to choose the actual cake instead? Yes it is. Ever since ruffles and frills have flounced their way back into the fashion zeitgeist, I have been pining for a garment that honestly, until now, I never had the audacity to actually wear, and this video seems like a potentially fitting excuse to make them from a purely superficial point of view, except the deeper I dug, the more rabbits I found, and well, we need to talk about it. But first, let's get into the nitty-gritty. I decided to work these shorts from the top down in a sport weight yarn, which of course was daunting, but also felt like the safest option to achieve the light flowy drape I wanted, while also not spending half the year on one single garment, though it was close enough. So to start, I worked on the waistband, which needed to be strong enough to hold the rest of the work up while also giving the illusion of a drawstring gather, since I wanted these shorts to be elasticated for both comfort and ease. The following section was going to be the first gather section to create that voluminous piped whipped cream frosting element, because in order to become the cake, I had to think like the cake, and since cakes don't actually have any thoughts, the only way I could strive towards enlightenment was through what I like to call the desertification of the mind. In essence, the idea was to create a base for the ruffles to sit on top of. The hardest part was going to be getting the proportions right, so I just had to see how it went as I went. And try not to overthink things too much, if at all, which was easier said than done. Because apart from somewhat fitting the whole cake theme, what do ruffled bloomers have to do with anything? Aren't they a Victorian thing anyway? Well, yes and no. When you think of bloomers, you may think of the Victorian period and women's rights activist Amelia Jenks Bloomer, after whom they were named. Or you may think of bloomers as in vintage underwear, which is what I knew them as first. Coincidentally, or not, I also read that the original bifurcated bottoms were actually often labelled as underwear by the, how shall we put it, the pocket watch-clutching persons of Victorian society. But the shorts I'm attempting to make are closer to the garments which evolved from the actual underwear branch of the bloomer tree, which was more of a 20th century thing, so they're technically more Victorian in name than anything else. Confused? Join the club. I hear it comes with a sandwich. As evidenced on the runways and inside our algorithmic mazes, ruffled shorts have recently undergone a revival, a great deal of which due to the popularization of the coquette aesthetic, named after the French term, which according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary is a woman who endeavors without sincere affection to gain the attention and admiration of men. Why not? Perhaps they have cake. You may have even heard this term used to describe Marie Antoinette herself, who is not only one of the main style icons for this genre of dress, but a woman haunted by the less favorable versions of the label permanently plastered against her forehead throughout her reign, regardless of how accurate they may or may not have been. But the real question is, did Marie Antoinette wear bloomers? Probably, very likely, no. But by some strange twist of fate, after I had already embarked on my blooming knit, I stumbled upon this portrait from 1783 called La Reine en Gaule, or as they say in Francais, La Reine en Gaule. That is honestly the best I can do, so apologies to any francophones watching. And as a forewarning, there will be plenty more terrible pronunciation to come. Long story short, this scandalous painting is a sordid depiction of Marie Antoinette in nothing but her underwear. Well, not really, but momentum is captivating. Speaking of shorts, the pattern for these ribbed shorts is now available in my Patreon shop, linked down below. I want to say a big thank you to everyone who already got this pattern. It really helps to make these videos possible, and I am so very grateful for your support. Like the first bloomers, this dress wasn't underwear, but to the French public at the time, it resembled the simple chemise worn by the upper classes as underwear. This garment was said to be a favorite fashion of the Queen, and it seemed to be a commonly held theory that it had something to do with her highly romanticized ideas of pastoral life. And evidently, that trend never quite went out of fashion. It might even help to explain the milkmaid styles of recent years, except instead of in private palace gardens, it was all on social media feeds. Marie Antoinette, more like Marie Internet. Marie the Internet? Wait, was Marie Antoinette an influencer? There's a conspiracy theory brewing in there somewhere. Alas, despite the style having been worn by others before her, following the controversies of Antoinette's portrait, the dress has been most well known since as the chemise à la reine, or in plain English, the Queen's shirt, aka the Queen's underwear within the context of 18th century France. Now, as I mentioned, despite the suspicious aesthetic similarities, this project was not inspired by this dress, directly at least, and as far as I can tell, barely anyone is wearing ruffled bloomers as actual underwear today. Not that I would know if they were. So understandably, the idea of wearing underwear in public was pretty scandalous back then, but why is it completely normalized today? In their own way, it feels like both instances are kind of giving the emperor's new clothes, i.e. the story about self-deception, conformity, and complicity. On one hand, you had a queen whose inner circle probably closely resembled her outer circle, and it's easy to assume that no one was going to tell her what the public would think, probably because they too had fallen in love with the style, and the idea of the haves having zero concept of what the have-nots thought is a tale as old as time itself. On the other hand, mainstream fashion today has completely merged the aesthetics of traditional undergarments into everyday wear. Of course, this is nothing new. The idea of wearing underwear as outerwear has often been used as a way to subvert societal norms and expectations, especially when it comes to women's fashions. But it might be fair to say that at this point, the concept has blended so much into the wallpaper that it's not so easy to tell where the underwear begins or ends. To me, at least, it all just reads as clothing now. When I wear a t-shirt, it never crosses my mind that t-shirts used to be the working man's undershirt, which, in a way, basically means that I'm a rebellious woman with little regard for society, and if you can't handle me at my worst, then you sure as hell don't deserve me at my best. Okay, fashion evolves, the fringes eventually make it into the middle, and the square pegs eventually get worn down into round ones. I mean, what's next? Sleepwear as sportswear? Casual wear as workwear? Never mind. You get the gist. At most, these knitted bloomers might be worn as a petticoat for bolder styles or even costumes, but generally speaking would be more likely seen as a playful and somewhat eccentric pair of summer shorts. But do you know who else wears ruffles and bloomers? Clowns. And at last, I'm finally embracing my inner sad clown as my outer reality. Maybe it was about time, but it was always inevitable. In the same way that two negative numbers make a positive, the subversion is no longer subverting, and it looks like it hasn't been for a while. So I wonder what's next. Plated armor and Tudor ruffs? Here's to crinolines not rising up from the ashes. I really like how it's looking so far, and I think I could have settled for even less gathering, but I still like it. I might frog a couple of rounds here because I think I've made too many. But yeah, I'm going to repeat this section a couple more times, and then I'm going to get started on either the ruffles or the legs of the short. I haven't really decided yet, but I don't think it really matters. I'm trying not to get too excited, but I'm really excited. I also think my elastic is probably a little too loose, so I will tighten it later on. Whichever directions mainstream fashions have been going in, there seems to be a solid progression, or regression, towards comfort. If history class has taught us anything, it's that Henry VIII had 6 wives because he was the problem, and that clothing back then was harder to make, maintain, and wear. But recent years and world events have shown us that when the going gets tough, the scruff gets going. Why dress in limiting clothing if you're not even going to leave your bedroom? Why dress uncomfortably when the environment is already doing such a fantastic job? Perhaps the kings and queens of Europe and modern-day celebrities have always been able to wear such opulent and restrictive clothing given that their lives, in a material sense, were and are so comfortable. And while the supposed cultural elite play dress-up, we dress down in our second skins, watching the world on repeat. Corsets may or may not throw a spanner in these works, but in a sense, their structure feels almost armor-like. And functionally supportive or not, it's easy to see how they would add to this modern-day dynamic in their own way. Should we pass on the hemline and high heel indexes in favor of the comfort index? At this point, it might be a more accurate measure of the absolute state of affairs. With these shorts being so far out of my own comfort zone, practically, stylistically, and conceptually speaking, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't apprehensive about making them. But something about them has just always been appealing. It could be the fun, voluminous silhouette, the viscerally nostalgic appeal, or even just the obvious physical comfort of wearing them, if not a combination of all three. In truth, they remind me of the overpiping of the still popular vintage Lambeth cakes, which are, in a roundabout, diluted way, also inspired by the Rococo period. And this makes me think that it all just comes down to the fact that they remind me of confectionery. Because if I had to choose between comfort and actual confectionery, i.e. all the best things in the world in all the best colors and shapes, drenched, doused, draped, and filled with the most addictive substances known to man, who am I kidding? The two aren't mutually exclusive, and the term comfort eating certainly springs to mind. Evidently, this is not a new concept by any means, since food has often been associated with both the Rococo period and the French Revolution. In 2021, around the same time the coquette aesthetic was gaining more traction, Vogue's oral history of Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette was published. In it, the movie costume designer Milena Canonero said the following: "Sophia brought me a big box of delicious Ladurée macarons as a present, but she also said that she wanted the pastel colors to inspire the palette of the costumes in Marie Antoinette. And if you've seen the film, you can definitely see the influence and how well it turned out." The origins of the macaron were far more humble, And unlike the Parisian-style confections that inspired the movie costumes, those made during the French Revolution were notably simpler. These humble pastries were a single cookie, baked and sold by two nuns as a means to survive after the suppression of religion imposed by the new revolutionary authorities. The nuns, who became known as the Macaron sisters, later adopted an orphaned boy, who they named after the sweet almond-based pastry, and he eventually became the president of France, President Macaron. Wait a second. Another example originates during the Reign of Terror. Equality bread, or pain d'égalité, was created as the government struggled to feed the city of Paris. When it came to bread, bakers were only allowed to bake this sturdy loaf made up of 1/4 rye and 3/4 wheat. More like the pain of equality. That's not. In a sense, these foods were far closer to the hemp fabrics worn by, as English rock band Pulp sang, common people, than the crisp white cottons and linens of the upper classes with their soft white bread made with refined wheat flour. Is it a coincidence that this equality bread was healthier than the refined carbohydrates eaten by the upper classes, and that hemp was and remains more environmentally sustainable than cotton? Food for thought. Soon enough, I began to realize that my continental knitting was starting to look neater than my English, and this was a day I'd never thought I'd see. I then started to work the gathers in again because I wanted extra volume at the bottom of the shorts for that ballooned piping effect. Upon trying them on, I was swiftly reminded that despite trying to live by the notion of always looking forward, what was left behind hadn't actually gone anywhere. So this is what it meant to have your past catch up to you. And needless to say, it didn't feel great. Here's the deal, I wasn't sure if I needed any extra coverage given the sheer volume of stitches, but of course no matter how many there were, I still had 3 options. Number 1, ignore the potential red flags, they may as well be blue. Or purple for that matter. What's the difference anyway? Number 2, carry on knitting as is and just make things longer. Or number 3, add German short rows and pretend like this conversation never happened. The 4th would have been to give up. The 5th involved the lighter. So let's not go there. Don't you just hate it when you're stuck between a rococo and a hard place? Now that really takes the cake. Seeing as the main issue, i.e. my inability to ignore this predicament, was coupled with not wanting to add any more length to the front, short rows it was, and that meant frogging. Hours later, and I had finished adding extra volume, and so far, it looked like things made sense for what I assumed they should have looked like. And you'll see exactly why I phrased that so weirdly. But until then, let's continue excavating through the layers of civilizations until we dig a hole all the way down to the prehistoric period, because that's precisely how long it was going to take for me to even realize my grave mistake. And that's all before attempting to rectify it. Admittedly, I may at times have a flair for the dramatic, but this wasn't exactly the case this time, because I decided that it would be the perfect opportunity to forego the unpretentious knit-two-together fold-over hem for each leg, because it was actually the time to try grafting them instead, requiring considerably more time to complete each and every stitch. Don't get me wrong, I loved this finishing, it looked amazing, and we're not going to talk about just how long it took me to realize that all of my first attempt was completely twisted, and certainly not how mind-numbingly tedious this type of stitching is to undo. It's not like I had to go through it twice for each leg, right? And it's really not like I hadn't already completed one leg hem with the usual fold over first, right? Sure, that was bad, but there was more, and I'll explain when the time comes. And if you've lost what went where, when, or how, then congratulations. As the cool kids say nowadays, you have met the appropriate vibrational frequency range. But first, in a desperate search of not-so-instant gratification, I decided to swiftly move on to the first ruffle tier. With all of my life experiences brought together to create the person I was at this one point in time, it only made sense to knit the ruffle separately first, before attaching it to the body of the shorts. Why, you may ask? Like I said, the universe compelled me to. But the logic went something along the lines of creating a frilled top edge first, before having the option to continue the ruffle to lengths unbound. Plus, it felt like a good idea to minimize the amount of handling of the rest of the work to avoid premature pilling and fuzz. This was some seriously flawless forethought, I thought. Surely no one could argue with this. Of course, the picot cast on hurt my fingers. Sure, the counting was horrific, some of the most horrendous I'd ever encountered. But it was so going to be worth it. Everything was going to line up, stitch to stitch like the legs of long-lost millipede twins, holding legs as they walk into the sunset together. You know what I mean. For once, I had rediscovered the type of unbridled optimism and unfounded ambition of my youth. Yeah, wanting to become an astronaut sounds swell and all, but how on earth were roller coasters ever family friendly? But I digress. This was exhilarating. I was on a roll. What could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? The folly of man. So I've just started attaching the frill, and as you can see, it doesn't really stand up very well on its own. In my attempt to prevent my excitement from getting the better of me, I ended up knitting too far. The frill was now frump, and I in turn became sad, deflated, lump. Sure, my feathers had been ruffled, my plans spoiled, nay foiled, but still drunk on optimism, the toxins of illusion and delusion ran through my withered veins, and I told myself, so I think I'm going to frog a few rows and try again. They were rounds, you silly goose. They were rounds. There were hundreds of stitches in this one round, far more than the one it was going to be attached to, but I was eventually going to decrease enough for the numbers to be the same. During this process, I couldn't help but second-guess the frilliness of the top edge, so I decided to try a 1-to-1 stitch-for-stitch ratio, and, well, it was underwhelming to say the least. The uniformity of it all was disturbing me. It doesn't really give that gathered effect that I'm looking for, so I'm going to try and insert the other one now, but I'm glad I tested this one out just to see the difference. One never becomes chaos. The chaos becomes you. Later that night, the problem never left. Like a vengeful boomerang with a screwed-up sense of justice, it came back just to mock me. What choice did I have but to start all over again? Although I kind of liked the frilled edge attempt, it was kind of giving the wrong energy. More boho than bougie. But really, what's the difference these days anyway? I gave up on the top tier and moved straight down to the bottom one, which was, in hindsight, quite symbolic, because it also meant that although I was starting from the bottom, I was inevitably going to work my way up, to the very end. That got dark. No doubt, round upon round of plain stockinette was growing tiresome, filling my skull with white cotton noise. So, to snap out of it, I figured why not completely jeopardize my current reality by trying on the work so far. What a wonderful idea that would be, only to find that I really messed up. It's really bad. Okay, so this is the front of the shorts, and here's the back. Everything looks fine, but let me try them on. Okay, the front looks great. Obviously it's not finished, and I think I might include a ribbon of some sort. But check this out. There is a lot of excess here. Otherwise, I really like how everything's going. But before I could remedy this, I had to finish the ruffle. And let me tell you, these picots were becoming the bane of my existence, and forced me to accept that becoming a tricoteuse wasn't so much in the cards for me as becoming a picoteuse was. Eventually, the buffer no longer buffered, and the stitch buffet had come to an end, because it turned out that everything south of the final tier had been contaminated with clothesridium botulinum. The sickness had set in, and the purge was nearing. All I had to do first was undo the hems, and this took forever. Let's not beat around the blooming bush. This was totally avoidable had I tried everything on before hemming each leg. But one simply cannot exist on this earth, second-guessing each and every action made, every thought thunked, every breath breathed. Or can they? I should clarify that everything seemed okay before completing the first leg, but of course the problem became much more apparent once the final forms had been completed and the overall drape established. And had I freehand knit ruffled bloomers before, I would have seen it coming. This frogging saga felt like an eternity, and of course it was painful to acknowledge over and over again each and every round that I still remembered creating throughout the days prior. This ordeal was like watching The Godfather Part 2 all over again. It was a slow, maddening descent into a spiritual void, with sporadic interruptions reminding me of the good old days, when I thought what I was doing was right, only to realize, ultimately, just how wrong I was, all along. But this time, there was simply no other option, and no one else to blame but myself. And gravity, of course, but what can't we blame that for? The omnipotent force that pulls us towards the Earth's searing core, the reason we cannot fly, the mastermind behind face and butt lifts, the sole culprit of why we're not on Cloud 9. Hang on, is gravity the devil? Because the devil may work hard, but the negative mass of this frog works harder. Clearly, despite what the extravagance of pre-revolution France actually symbolized, many, if not most of us today, probably still favor the aesthetics of the bourgeoisie over that of the proletariat, even if, like me, it's more if not only about the cake. But here's how I think you can still have your cake and eat it, and I've been doing it this entire time. Knitting was such a memorable act during the French Revolution's reign of terror that a nickname was given to a woman who sat and knit while watching the guillotine, a tricoteuse, which literally means a knitting woman, and is still used outside of this historical context. And if you've read Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which I'll admit I still haven't, you may recall Madame Defarge. From what I gather, she is a complex character. Now, if bringing your knitting along to public executions sounds to you like some morally dubious pastime at best, you'd probably be correct. But here's the context. Tricoteuses didn't start off as crafting enthusiasts with a thirst for blue blood. Actually, who knows, maybe the meditative nature of crafting took the edge off. In a spoonful of sugar kind of way. It turns out that the tricoteuses were the very same working-class women who were responsible for the 1789 Women's March on Versailles, demanding bread during a time when food prices were high and shortages constant. The march was a success, and the women were celebrated as heroes for not only having their demands met, but for also chasing the king out from his palace. This major event is recognized as a pivotal moment and catalyst for the revolution as a whole, which is what makes the rest of this story all the more messed up. Because not 4 years later, the revolutionary government, due to their ever-growing authoritarian ways, banned the very same women from forming and participating in any political groups due to them being, as stated in the article, quote, dangerously unpredictable market women, and seen as a liability. And to quote directly the only referenced author for this Wikipedia page, historian and Professor H. Moore Stevens, thus deprived of active participation in politics, the market women became the tricoteuses, or knitting women, who used to take their seats at the Place de la Révolution and watch the guillotine as they knitted. You could say that this may have been intended and/or perceived as a form of silent protest. Surely truly dangerous and disruptive women don't sit and knit while actual heads roll like balls of yarn. Honestly, it's hard to tell what the exact message was, if any at all. Clearly, tricoteuses played a significant and early role in the revolution, but unfortunately and unsurprisingly, relatively little seems to have been documented about these working class women. And it was disappointing to see how very limited the admittedly more easily accessible information was. Aside from online articles repeating the same limited amounts of information, I did find a couple of books that looked like they might shed more light on them, but that was pretty much it. So by the time Marie Antoinette was soon to meet her fate, the tricoteuses would have been knitting in the crowd, and the thought of what they may have made during this time is a definition of morbid curiosity, to say the least. I finished off each leg with some more picots, and the frills turned out like the frilled edges of a macaron, which I thought was rather fitting. And how could we possibly conclude the making of this garment without the mostly non-functional addition of crocheted ribbon bows? I actually got really tired of everything at this point and decided to move on to the top half of this outfit. For reasons I'll soon divulge, I wanted to incorporate diamonds and bows in this next knit, except I wasn't sure how. So I hurried over to my Instagram to ask you if you preferred diamond cables or diamond lace, while giving barely any context or clues. But boy did you come through, and the results were actually kind of surprising. 26% of you chose cables, while 74% of you chose lace. Honestly, this was a really tough call for me, so thank you for helping me decide. Now, all I had to do was make up several lace patterns, narrow them down to a few, refine the selection into one, and swatch it successfully. Suffice it to say, I may have bitten off more than I could chew, but as the kids in France say, sous la vue. I also attempted to make a bow using pearl stitches, but the only way that worked out was in opposite land. I don't know what this is. And of course I wasn't going to knit this lace project using cotton, so I had this fingering weight pink wool blend. And when it came to this project, it seemed like a much better option in terms of colour as well. I got this yarn because I wanted to recreate a vintage Versace cable piece, but just never got round to it. This, however, was the sample I gave up on. So I decided to move forward with this yarn and obviously had to swatch everything first to find the gauge. I was left with a bit of a conundrum, in that I preferred the right side of the lace, but the wrong side gave a better definition to the bow pattern. I decided to begin with what I assumed would be the back panel just to get a feel of the lace as a fabric. I think this was my second attempt as I decided the first attempt was far too wide. And I have to be honest, I didn't have a concrete idea of what I was making. I still hadn't decided on the size, fit, length, neckline. Basically the entire silhouette was still up in the air. And this was mostly because I still didn't know how the fabric would behave, like how much weight it could support, whether or not it needed shaping, how much shaping it would need, was the stretch going to compound exponentially, was the lace design going to work? It's probably fair to say that Marie Antoinette was the original goat of the coquette aesthetic, a style with roots in Lolita fashion which by definition is specifically inspired by the Victorian and Rococo periods, hence the bloomers and ruffles of the previous project. However, the four-legged animal was also seemingly synonymous with the queen, given the rumors of her cosplaying peasantry by tending to perfumed goats and sheep while frolicking in imported cotton dresses. Anyway, when it comes to this French queen, no single goat has been goated, quite like the scapegoat, with lies not quite as white as snow, and everywhere that Marie went, this goat was sure to go. One very famous example is known as the affair of the diamond necklace, which, if you hadn't guessed already, is the main inspiration for this cardigan. Now, it is a pretty complicated story, so here's the gist of it. This is the diamond necklace, and as you can see, it was the main inspiration for the lace pattern with its diamonds and bows. This necklace wasn't actually made for Marie Antoinette, but ordered by her deceased father-in-law for his mistress, Madame du Barry, who she apparently didn't like very much. However, the diamonds took a long time to source, and the former king passed before it could all be paid for. As you can guess from the sheer extravagance of this piece, this put the jewelers in a dire situation with a lot of debt, given that the estimated equivalent value of the necklace today would be over $15 million. Take that to the Met Gala. As such, the jewelers tried on multiple occasions to sell the necklace to the then current queen, Marie Antoinette. However, she refused each and every time, having been quoted as saying that the country had more need for ships than for necklaces. Nevertheless, this back and forth made sure that her name was synonymous with this necklace and any drama surrounding it. And to fast forward in every sense, along came con woman Jeanne de la Motte, who impersonated the queen and made off with the necklace, leaving the jewelers in ruins and Antoinette's reputation in the gutter, adding yet another step up to the stage of the guillotine. At this point, I couldn't help but feel like something was missing. I mean, under any other circumstance, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it, but this was a Rococo-themed fit. Other than this, I think everything's looking good, and I guess this one is just a really, really big swatch. Now, not only do I not have access to $15 million worth of diamonds, but real or fake, I was convinced that they would only look undesirably gaudy on this project. So instead, it is happening. Up until now, I had successfully avoided using minuscule crochet hooks, but part of me was really excited to try them for the first time. Except this was in the context of adding beads, which probably doesn't count. That said, pulling a live stitch through the tiny eye of one was supremely satisfying and also crocodile mind-bending. How was this possible? It didn't make sense, but it was, and it did. I'll admit, I was so thrilled by this revelation that I couldn't wait for the next beaded row, and this primal motivation definitely helped to keep any stitch boredom at bay. Contrary to the Marilyn Monroe classic, clearly diamonds are not a girl's best friend. They're cold, hard, and a little too transparent at times, and all I'm saying is that things can get quite rocky if you catch my drift. The affair of the diamond necklace was just another instance of the ways in which Marie Antoinette had been scapegoated throughout her life and, evidently, the centuries that followed. The more I delved into the depths, the general consensus seemed to be that regardless of who she was, what she was remained a symbol of the cosmic disparity between the people and the elite, and as a woman whose life and image in many ways was sacrificed to the public, she was the lamb to the slaughter, a dangling carrot to distract from the actions of powerful men. There's a lot of sympathy for Marie Antoinette, and it's easy to see why. But the contrasting absence of information about the women who pushed the revolution forward to feed their starving families does leave an undesirable aftertaste after consuming all this decadence. I mean, what's the royal equivalent of first world problems? Elite class issues? Undoubtedly, they sounded truly awful, and it may be of no consolation to historical figures, but at least the world still knows about them centuries later. I think that if extensive information about the so-called knitting women is out there, then a lot of it is probably in French. And the reality remains that people likely care a lot less about these seemingly monolithic women of low status than about Marie Antoinette. Their lives simply weren't glamorous or enticing enough. But would that be anything new? It was hard not to notice a similarity between the scapegoating of Marie Antoinette, the mother of modern-day ruffles, bows, and frills, and the general scapegoating of feminine dress for the negative stereotyping of women and femininity as a whole.
But Marie Antoinette had to be a witch. How else do you explain the hair?
To answer seriously, apparently the trick was using a combination of animal fats and white flour. So she wasn't a witch, she was actually a cake, and she told people to eat her. Okay, back to the point. Why have ruffles and bows come to be known as mostly, if not only, for girls? Obviously this hasn't always been the case, as seen throughout even the last century, but I can't help but wonder if the infamous scapegoating of Marie Antoinette had anything to do with it. Of course, it could just be a coincidence, or it could just be scapegoat chic. Perhaps it's just the time and/or culture that I grew up in. Well, of course it is. But the idea of clothing being, quote, too girly and that being a bad thing is still a core memory for me. In some ways, it is refreshing to be living through yet another revival of this romantic style. But I'm still waiting for menswear to catch up off the runways. The 80s did it, why can't we? On second thoughts, never mind. A better question might be this: in an ideal world, why wouldn't we all want to dress like cake? I think I just answered my own question. It feels like everyone's always trying to be delicious, but maybe they're going about it the wrong way. Again, finalizing the design of this soon-to-be cardigan was still proving difficult. I needed to finish making up my mind about the silhouette, or else I risked rendering the large panels I was completing completely redundant. But at the very least, if this was to happen, I could still clutch my pearls. Literally. And that would have made it all worth it. Well, not really. Eventually, after flip-flopping between a square and V-neck, I decided that although the square neckline would have been a nice reference to the Rococo period, the compounded weight of the initially lightweight yarn might not hold it well enough. Plus, a V-neck would work best with the diagonal lines of the diamond patterns, and the drape would also be simpler. The neckline shaping was one of my main concerns, seeing as things always seem to work in theory, but the resulting aesthetics were yet to be seen. Nonetheless, the first side went smoothly enough, and I managed to get the right amount of depth and width that I aimed for from the start. I really underestimated how quick each side was to work up, so that was a pleasant surprise. Although, it's not a big deal. It wasn't a big deal. But like almost anything, it's a huge one if you make it one. Do you remember playing Spot the Difference? Because this version wasn't much fun. In fact, it was the worst I'd ever played. To summarize, I decided to skip a bead on the first panel because of the decreases, and didn't think too much of it, because, well, it was only the one bead. And for the purposes of managing the daily list of mundane disappointments, I had already prepared myself to accept some level of irregularity caused by the shaping. That was until I realized that it was really easy to include said bead on the other side. Which meant that everything was now asymmetrical, and I had to reevaluate my coping mechanisms and change them into hoping mechanisms. It's a small detail, I could just stitch it in, but if I'm totally honest, the idea of stitching one bead in but not the rest is a little much for me. Maybe I'll feel better about it later, so I'm going to leave the potential frogging much later. That said, the good thing about it is that I'll be able to double check my charting, so I guess that is a silver lining. It's decided. Obviously, knowing what I then knew, there was a decision to make, and I figured the safest way to do it was to give things some time and return to the situation after finishing the second panel. But of course, over the course of the day, my willpower had dwindled into nil power, and fixing this minuscule detail was the only way to claw back some serotonin. Was I overreacting? Possibly. But the thought of only one stitched-in pearl among a bed of knitted pearls was a thought I struggled to accept when there was still a chance to fix it. So the reason why I initially skipped this single bead soon became very apparent. It was just unintuitive, but still very much possible. Brace yourselves. Technically, after a couple more rows on this side, I should be able to knit the two of these at the same time. Now I had to contend with the urge to knit both panels on the same cable. I get why this is often referred to as knitting two things at once, but after trying this a few times, it still just feels like working one item after the other. Plus, fixing any mistakes suddenly becomes so much more complicated than it needs to be. But then again, there is still the appeal of what feels like digging two holes with one shovel, and I just couldn't resist, until the awkward waiting of the cable reminded me of why I never really stayed with it. Now that each and every panel was complete, it was time to begin the construction. So I started by grafting the shoulders together using the Kitchener stitch before checking the general fit and drape on the stand. Obviously this was kind of useless seeing as the sleeves would determine everything, but it was more of an indulgent pat on the back for finally getting to this point. But really, it was a good opportunity to check if anything had gone terribly wrong, and fortunately nothing had, so far. Now this may be a point of contention for some, or it may not. I was tempted to block everything at this point because not only would it get the majority of it out of the way, but it would straighten out all the edges and make seaming much easier and more reliable when it came to the final measurements. Not to mention that this was lace, and that's what you're supposed to do. However, I had yet to knit the ribbing, and since I planned on making the waistband and cuffs quite wide, I didn't want to leave them unblocked, and blocking twice just seemed a little excessive. So as a compromise, I steamed the edges to get them remotely workable before connecting the pieces together with some mercerized cotton to reduce any felting. The plan was to attach the sleeves first, and I wanted to achieve something that felt like the unachievable. I wanted to match the diamond widths with the diamond lengths, and in theory, this was doable, but from experience, there was a decent chance that it would all end in disaster. But tempting fate is a well-established way to squeeze the proverbial lemons of life, and I was ready to get juiced up. I don't have the footage to show you because I went full tunnel vision on this task, but after multiple attempts, I had finally cracked the code. These diamonds matched up so perfectly they may as well have been bonded covalently. But how did they look on the stand? Okay, now I just need to do the other side. Hours of careful seaming later, it was finally time to move on to the ribbing. I chose a 1x1 rib because I wanted as much contraction as I could get to achieve that soft vintage balloon-waisted silhouette, which might not be the best way to describe it, but I hope you get what I mean. I ended up knitting a rather wide waistband, again for the vintage feel, but also to add length to get the cardigan below waist level. I then knit the rib along the front and neckline of the cardigan, adding in some buttonholes for the closure. I have to say that deciding on the buttons was more difficult than it should have been. On one hand, it was a perfect opportunity to go all out, like cuckoo rococo puffs. Perhaps buttons with a pearl or diamante trim, rhinestones, filigree metalwork, heck, even hand embroidery. You name it, I was thinking about it, but the image that kept coming up was costume jewelry. And as tempted as I remained, over-the-top buttons just weren't right for this cardigan. Pearl beads were a suitable and less extravagant option, but I didn't find any that I liked that were also a good match for the beads I'd already used. So I decided to make my own, and used self-cover buttons, which were a little on the large side, but they're the ones I had, and I still liked the proportions. I decided against crocheting the button cover as I'd first imagined, because I was worried about potential bulk, and given how big these buttons already were, I didn't want to risk making them heavier than they needed to be. So, for the first time ever, I decided to try knitting a circle from the center outwards. And for this, I had to learn the pinhole cast on, and it was definitely a little fiddly. Thrilled with my new unlocked achievement, I was so excited to see what the buttons looked like on the cardigan that I hastily stitched them on, prematurely, throwing the crucial lace blocking to the wind. Luckily, however, I thought they suited the rest of the project, and they also reminded me of macarons, which was a plus. I think I could even add a frilled edge at some point to really hammer the reference home, but of course I ended up removing them and stitched them in later with a sturdier cotton thread. It was for the best, I told myself.
Okay, I need to block everything first.
While things were blocking, I returned to the ribbons for the bloomer shorts and thread actual ribbons through the double crochet ones. It turned out that this combination was kind of tricky to thread through each channel, so I think using either a wider ribbon or a sturdier crochet one would have worked better. For me, the hems were wide enough. I wasn't mad about how it ended up looking, but it probably wasn't worth the extra hassle. I then refit the waistband elastic, made the final touches, and it was over. As outside of my comfort zone these shorts are, I actually love them. They are everything I hoped for and are so much fun to wear. Moving on to the cardigan, the lace fabric turned out much better than I first imagined while drafting it, and is definitely my favorite part. Blocking and steaming did wonders on the drape, and I think the V-neck was the right option in the end. I did end up being a little overzealous with the sleeves because I wanted the extra length, but I eventually decided against them despite liking the long sleeve look. It just wasn't practical and didn't always drape well when wearing the cuffs properly. The irony of using this revolutionary craft to create a somewhat extravagant outfit inspired by the very thing that was being revolted against is not lost on me. In some ways, it feels like a matter that's potentially as tangled as an unsuccessful center yarn pull, but you eventually choose the part that makes the most sense and see where it goes from there. And in a sense, this irony is ironed out by a different kind, one that references the symbolic yet pragmatic knitting of the tricoteuses, turns underwear into outerwear, wears stolen diamonds and bows, all in the name of becoming the rich, decadent cake Marie Antoinette never said we could eat. And yet, I'm having my cake, and eating it. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this one. I will be back with yet another yarn-filled escapade. See you in the next one.